The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1886. A Lantern Library retelling. London, a city of manners and propriety on the surface. But I've lived here long enough to know that beneath the gaslight glow, behind polished doors and respectable names, lies another world entirely. One of secrets, shame, and things that cannot bear the daylight. I'm Gabriel Utterson, a lawyer, known for being calm and steady. I don't rush to judge, nor meddle in the private lives of my friends, but there are times when events force one to peer into the shadows, whether one wishes to or not. It began, as so many stories do, with something that at first seemed trivial, a Sunday walk with my distant cousin, Mr. Richard Enfield. We've long made a habit of strolling the streets together, our conversations meandering as much as our route. That day the streets were quiet, the air damp with a rolling, yellowish fog. As we turned down a narrow byway, I noticed a door, nothing remarkable in size, but so run down and neglected it seemed almost out of place. The paint was blistered, the wood bruised, the brass knob tarnished. Yet something about it held my gaze. Enfield noticed. "I know this door," he said grimly, and then he told me a story I wouldn't soon forget. Enfield had been walking home in the early hours one winter morning when he saw, on this very street, a small, misshapen man stride into view from the opposite direction. At the same moment, a little girl came running from a side street, hurrying for a doctor. The two collided. In that fleeting moment, I can almost see it. The girl's small frame darting through the fog, her breath puffing in the cold. Hyde's boots strike the pavement, relentless, his eyes glinting with indifference as he barrels forward. The girl fell, screaming, and the man stepped over her. No pause, no apology. He simply trampled her down and kept walking, as if she were no more than an obstacle in his path. Enfield and others gave chase, catching the man before he turned the corner. He was pale, twisted in shape, with a face so unpleasant that the onlookers instinctively drew back. There was no one thing wrong with him, but the overall effect was repellent. It made you feel, as Enfield put it, like you'd just stepped on something foul. They threatened to raise a scandal unless he made amends. Calmly, the man agreed. He led them to this very door, unlocked it, and vanished inside for several minutes. When he returned, he held a check for a large sum, signed in the name of a most respectable gentleman, Dr. Henry Jekyll. Enfield didn't know how the two men were connected, but there was something in the man's smug composure, as though he knew himself untouchable, that stayed with him. As we walked on, I asked his name. The fog thickened, swallowing the street lamp's glow, as if the city itself hid secrets in its murky depths. "Edward Hyde," Enfield replied. Back at my office that evening, I unlocked my private safe and drew out a certain document, Dr. Jekyll's will. Henry Jekyll was more than a client. He was a dear old friend. We'd dined together often, and I'd always admired his generosity and cheer. Yet here, in black and white, was a clause that had troubled me since the day I first read it. In the event of Jekyll's death, or even his unexplained absence for more than 3 months, all his possessions were to pass immediately to Edward Hyde. No further explanation, no mention of family. Now, hearing Enfield's tale, my unease hardened into something darker. Who was this Hyde, that Jekyll should entrust him with everything? I resolved to meet him myself. For several evenings in a row, I stationed myself within sight of the mysterious door, rapped against the damp London chill, eyes scanning every passer-by. And then, one night, I saw him. It was late, the streets almost empty, when I noticed a small figure approaching from the far end. Even from a distance, there was something unnatural in the man's movement. Quick, deliberate, yet somehow furtive, as though the very air recoiled from him. When we were near enough, I stepped forward. "Mr. Hyde," He froze, like an animal caught in the lamplight, then turned sharply toward me. His face, I can't find words for it. It was not grotesque in any obvious way, yet there was a deformity without form, an ugliness that seemed to radiate from within. His skin was pale, almost gray, his lips thin and tightly pressed. "I see you know my name," he said softly. "I'm a friend of Dr. Jekyll's," I replied. "We share a great many interests." That crooked smile spread across his face. "I never saw you before," he murmured, and there was a mocking edge to the words. "I must ask," I continued, "that you allow me to introduce myself properly." He hesitated, then handed me a card with his address written in an angular, almost spidery script. As he slipped past me, I realized my hands were clenched, and only then did I understand the strength of the dislike I felt for him. It was instinctive, almost primal, as though some part of me recognized in Hyde a corruption of humanity itself. A chill settled in my bones, not from the fog, but from the fear that my friend was entangled with something unspeakable. The next day, I called at Dr. Jekyll's house, a fine old property in a quiet square. His butler, Poole, showed me into the warm, well-lit dining room. Jekyll entered, tall, handsome, and every inch the gentleman I remembered. He greeted me warmly, pressing my hand with genuine affection. We spoke a while of mutual friends and the affairs of the day. At last, I broached the subject that had brought me. "Henry," I said carefully, "I've been learning a little about your friend, Mr. Hyde." Instantly, the warmth drained from his expression. His eyes sharpened, though his voice remained calm. "I don't care to speak of him, Utterson. I'm quite done with Hyde. You needn't trouble yourself. I can be rid of him whenever I please." But I could tell the conversation was over. I left with the distinct sense that my friend was hiding something from me, something dangerous. The city seemed to hold its breath, its alleys cloaked in mist, as if waiting for some unseen horror to emerge. Months passed, and then one foggy night, London was shaken by a crime of rare brutality. A maid, looking from her upstairs window, had seen an elderly gentleman, white-haired and kindly-faced, walking along the street below. He was met by a smaller man, whom she recognized as Edward Hyde. The two exchanged words, polite at first, but suddenly Hyde's manner changed. With a terrible cry, he raised a heavy cane and struck the old man down. Again and again he brought it down, long after his victim had fallen motionless. The maid, frozen with horror, could barely scream. By the time she found her voice and called for help, Hyde was gone into the night. The police found the victim's body broken and battered. In his pockets they discovered a letter addressed to me. It was Sir Danvers Carew, one of my clients. When the maid described the attacker, I knew. Hyde. My heart raced with dread. Had I missed a chance to save Carew? The weight of his death pressed on me, urging me to uncover Hyde's hold over my friend. I accompanied the police to Hyde's lodgings. They were neat, even tastefully furnished, but in a state of disorder, as though the occupant had left in a great hurry. In the fireplace lay the remains of a burnt checkbook, and in a cupboard they found the broken half of a cane. I recognized it instantly. I had given that cane to Dr. Jekyll years ago. The morning after Sir Danvers' murder, I hurried to Jekyll's house. He looked pale, but calmer than I expected, almost relieved. He swore to me, with a sincerity I couldn't doubt, that Hyde would trouble neither of us again. "I give you my word, Utterson, I'm done with him. For good." To prove it, he handed me a letter from Hyde, written in a cramped, nervous hand. In it, Hyde expressed regret for the inconvenience he'd caused, and declared he was leaving London forever. It was only later, when I compared the letter to other handwriting, that an uncomfortable truth emerged. Hyde's writing was eerily similar to Jekyll's own, identical in every way except the slant. I kept this observation to myself. In the weeks that followed, Jekyll returned to his old self. He hosted dinners, welcomed old friends, and seemed almost to glow with relief. One evening I joined him for dinner, his laughter ringing as he poured wine and spoke of new charities. For a moment, I believed the shadow had truly lifted. For 2 whole months there was no sign of Edward Hyde. Then, as suddenly as the light had returned, it vanished again. Poole told me his master had given up company entirely. The shutters were drawn, the gates locked. Meals were delivered to the laboratory door and collected in silence. I called repeatedly, but was turned away. Each visit to Jekyll's house grew heavier. The servants whispered of locked doors and strange noises from the laboratory. I stood in the foggy square, staring at the shuttered windows, my mind torn between duty to my friend and fear of what lay behind that silence. Days later, troubled by Jekyll's silence, I sought answers elsewhere. I visited our mutual friend, Dr. Lanyon. I hadn't seen him in weeks, and when he opened the door, I could hardly believe the change. His face was drawn, his hair had whitened, and his hands shook as he greeted me. "My dear Lanyon," I said, "you look as though you've had a terrible shock." "I have," he replied grimly, "and I don't expect to recover. It's not a matter for discussion. Indeed, I won't speak of it. But mark my words, I'm finished with Henry Jekyll. We shall not meet again." I pressed him for details, but he'd say no more. He only added, "Within a fortnight I shall be dead. And then, Utterson, you may learn the truth, not before." True to his word, Dr. Lanyon was buried 2 weeks later. In his will, he left me an envelope marked, "Not to be opened until the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll." Weeks passed, and a new dread settled over me. A bitter March wind cut through the city the night Poole came to me in distress. "Mr. Utterson," he said urgently, "there's something wrong with my master. I've been with him for 20 years, sir, and never seen the like." He told me Jekyll had locked himself in the laboratory for over a week. No one had seen his face. The voice that called through the door was high, strained, not Dr. Jekyll's voice at all. Once, Poole swore he heard weeping through the door and glimpsed a shadowed figure, small, hunched, not his master's form, moving behind the frosted glass. Worse still, the man inside had been sending frantic notes to chemists all over London, begging for a particular salt, always the same, and always rejecting it as not pure. "Sir," Poole said, lowering his voice, "I believe my master's been murdered, and whoever's in there is some foul creature pretending to be him." We went to the house together. The wind rattled the windows, and the shutters groaned in the dark. From behind the locked laboratory door came the thin, agitated voice, urging Poole to hurry and fetch another batch of the salt. When I demanded to speak to Jekyll face to face, the voice refused. It spoke rapidly, with an almost feverish urgency, then fell silent. Poole's face was set. "That's not my master's voice. I'll swear it." Poole and I stood in the dim hallway outside the laboratory, listening to the wind scrape along the shutters. Inside, all was still. I turned to him. "We must act. If Jekyll has been murdered, or if he's in danger, we can't stand here and wait." Poole nodded grimly. We armed ourselves with a heavy poker and an axe, and with the other servants gathered nervously below, we began to batter the door. The wood splintered, the lock gave way, and we burst into the laboratory. Alchemical instruments gleamed faintly in the dark, their glass vials catching the lamplight like eyes watching from the shadows. It was a large, shadowed room lit by a single flickering lamp. Tables were cluttered with glass vials, chemical powders, and books in strange languages. Near the fire lay a body, twisted on the floor, small, shrunken, dressed in ill-fitting clothes. In one hand, it clutched the remains of a crushed vial. I knelt to look. The face was unmistakable. Edward Hyde. His features were contorted, but in death there was a curious peace, as though some long torment had ended. There was no sign of Dr. Jekyll. On the desk was a neat stack of papers addressed to me. The top bore the words, Dr. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Beneath it was another, sealed in Lanyon's hand, the one I'd been forbidden to open until Jekyll's death or disappearance. It seemed that moment had come. I broke the seal on Lanyon's letter and began to read. He wrote of receiving, weeks earlier, an urgent note from Jekyll, begging him to go to Jekyll's laboratory, retrieve a certain drawer, and keep it safe until a man called for it at midnight. The drawer would contain a specific set of chemicals, a vial, and a notebook. The note's frantic tone unsettled me. Why such secrecy? My hands trembled as I gathered the drawer's contents, sensing a truth too dark to face. Lanyon, though bewildered, did as asked. That night, precisely at 12, a man arrived. He was Edward Hyde. Hyde was nervous, impatient, and spoke of life or death urgency. He mixed the chemicals with the contents of the vial, producing a strange, smoking draught. Before Lanyon's eyes, he raised the glass and drank. Almost instantly, his body convulsed, twisted, and seemed to swell. His face blurred, changed, reformed. When the process ended, Hyde was gone, and in his place stood Henry Jekyll. Lanyon wrote that the horror of what he'd seen was beyond words. In that instant, he knew that Jekyll and Hyde were the same person. The shock had destroyed his health. I must die, he concluded, and when I'm gone, let the world know what I've seen. Jekyll's own statement was longer and darker still. He began by describing his early life, respected, successful, admired. Yet within him, he said, there'd always been two natures, one inclined to virtue, the other to vice. These two selves were forever at war. Over the years, he became obsessed with the idea of separating them. Through careful study of medicine and chemistry, he created a potion that could transform him entirely into his darker self, free from conscience, free from shame. The first time he drank it, he felt liberated. In body, he became smaller, lighter, more agile, and wholly different in face and form. In spirit, he was freed from the weight of morality. He named this second self, Edward Hyde. At first, Hyde committed only small indulgences and petty cruelties, but as the transformations became easier, Hyde grew bolder. He took pleasure in trampling a child underfoot, feeling no guilt. When the scandal threatened to touch Jekyll, he simply changed back, and no one suspected. But Hyde's appetite for evil was insatiable. One night, in a sudden frenzy of rage, he murdered Sir Danvers Carew. The shock of it drove Jekyll to destroy his chemical supplies and vow never to take the potion again. For a time, he lived quietly, devoting himself to good works. I threw myself into charity, hoping to bury Hyde forever. Yet at night, I felt him stirring within me, a shadow waiting to claim my soul. But gradually, the darker nature stirred again. Without warning, in the middle of a walk in the park, he transformed into Hyde without taking the potion at all. One night, he woke in his own bed, heart pounding, hands smaller and colder than his own. In the mirror, Hyde's twisted face stared back, grinning. The potion hadn't been touched. His darker self was clawing free, unbidden, as if Jekyll's soul were no longer his own. Panic-stricken, he rushed to the laboratory and drank the draught to restore himself. From that moment, the transformations came more frequently, sometimes in his sleep. The balance had shifted. Hyde was growing stronger, Jekyll weaker. Desperate, he sent Poole to chemists across the city to find the exact salt that had worked before. None were pure enough. Without it, he couldn't change back once the transformation took hold. At last, trapped in Hyde's form, hunted by the police, he decided there was only one escape left. The draught he drank that night in the laboratory was no antidote, it was poison. He ended his confession with these words, "I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end." I sat in the fading lamplight of Jekyll's study, the final page trembling in my hand. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. Henry Jekyll, my friend, hadn't been murdered. He'd murdered himself to destroy the thing he'd become. My heart sank, heavy with pity for the friend I'd lost and dread for the truth I now carried. I left the house before dawn, the streets empty but for the shifting fog. Somewhere behind the clouds, the sun would rise, and the city would go on as if nothing had happened. But I knew, and I'd carry the knowledge and the warning for the rest of my days. In the heart of every man lies the seed of his own ruin, and once given shape, it can never truly be undone.